In the deep, folded hills of West Virginia, where the morning fog clings to the hollows and the nights are as dark as the coal buried beneath them, lies a story that America tried to forget. This is not a tale of presidents or famous generals. It is a story of the earth, of the men who went into its darkness every day, and of the fire that burned within them. It is the story of an army of 10,000 miners, fathers and husbands, who picked up their hunting rifles to fight for their freedom. The story of the largest armed uprising in the nation's history since its own Civil War. A war that was fought not in a foreign land, but here, at home, on a single, sprawling mountain. So find a comfortable place, and let the noise of the modern world fade away. Tonight, we travel back in time. We listen to the whispers of the mountains. We listen to the story of Blair Mountain. To understand what happened on Blair Mountain, you must first understand the land itself. Before the coal, before the railroads, before the anger that would shake the nation, there were the mountains of West Virginia. They are some of the oldest mountains on Earth, a landscape of deep, winding valleys, or hollers as they are known, carved by ancient rivers. For centuries, they stood as a quiet kingdom of green and gray, covered in a dense blanket of hardwood forest. Life here moved at the pace of the seasons. The air was clean, the water was clear, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind in the trees or the call of a distant bird. It was a place of profound beauty and profound isolation, a place that held its people and its secrets close. But deep beneath the forest floor, the mountains held another secret, a secret that was black, combustible, and immensely valuable. Bituminous coal. Seams of it, laid down hundreds of millions of years ago, ran through the rock like dark veins. For a long time, it was little more than a curiosity, something a local blacksmith might dig up for his forge. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, America was consumed by an insatiable hunger, a hunger for progress, for industry, for steel and steam. And the fuel for that hunger was coal. Suddenly, the quiet, isolated mountains of West Virginia became the focus of wealthy and powerful men from the north. They saw not the ancient forests, but the timber. They saw not the winding rivers, but pathways for their railroads. And they saw not the people who called these mountains home, but a workforce. They bought up vast tracts of land for pennies on the acre, acquiring mineral rights from families who had little understanding of the immense wealth they were signing away. And then, the change began. The sound of the forest was replaced by the blast of dynamite and the shriek of steel on steel as railroad tracks clawed their way into the deepest hollows. Small, self-sufficient farms gave way to sprawling industrial operations. And where there were once only scattered homesteads, new towns appeared almost overnight. But these were not ordinary towns. They were a special kind of creation, a world unto themselves, known as the company town. To live in a company town was to live in a state of total dependence. Imagine a world where one entity owns everything. The company owned the land the town was built on. It owned the simple, identical wooden houses, often hastily built and poorly insulated, that were rented to the miners and their families. It owned the only store, the company store, where everyone was forced to buy their food, their clothes, and their tools. The company owned the school where the children were taught, the church where the families prayed, and even the doctor's office. The company was the landlord, the employer, the merchant, and the law. A miner did not own his home. He merely occupied it at the pleasure of the coal operator. If he lost his job, for any reason, his family would be evicted, cast out of their home with nowhere to go. The primary tool of this control was a unique form of currency called scrip. Miners were often not paid in United States dollars. Instead, they were paid in company-minted coins or paper notes that were only valid in that one town, at that one company store. This system was a brilliant and cruel trap. It ensured that the wages paid to a miner for his dangerous work underground would flow directly back into the pockets of the company that employed him. The company store could set its prices as high as it wished, with no competition to keep them in check. Families found themselves sinking into a cycle of debt, always owing a little more to the company than they earned. Leaving was not an option, because their scrip was worthless in the outside world, and their debt held them captive. It was a system of economic bondage, a modern form of feudalism hidden away in the American mountains. And the reason for this entire system, the heart of this dark kingdom, was the mine itself. The work of a coal miner at the dawn of the 20th century was some of the most difficult and dangerous labor imaginable. Each morning, long before the sun rose over the mountain ridges, men and boys would walk to the mine entrance, the drift mouth, a dark opening in the hillside that seemed to swallow the light. They would ride a man trip, a simple string of carts deep into the belly of the earth. Down in the mine, the world disappeared. There was only darkness, a thick, suffocating blackness that the weak flames of their carbide lamps could barely push back. The air was cold and damp, thick with the taste of coal dust that coated their lungs and would one day give them the black lung, a slow, agonizing disease. The work was punishing. Lying on their sides in cramped tunnels, sometimes only a few feet high, they would spend 10 or 12 hours a day picking and blasting and shoveling coal. They were paid by the ton, but the company owned the scales, and it was a common and bitter complaint that those scales were never accurate. A miner had to provide his own tools, pay for the dynamite he used, and even pay the blacksmith for sharpening his picks. After all the deductions, a day's exhausting labor could leave a man with barely enough to feed his family from the overpriced shelves of the company store. But the physical toil was not the worst part. The worst part was the constant, silent fear. The mountain was alive around them. Timbers would groan under the immense weight of the rock above. The air itself could be a killer, filled with invisible, odorless pockets of methane gas that a single spark could ignite into a devastating explosion. And most common of all was the ever-present danger of a roof fall. A section of the rock ceiling could collapse without warning, crushing anyone beneath it. Every man who entered the mine knew he might not come out alive. They would see their friends and family members killed or maimed, and they knew their own turn could be next. Yet every morning, they went back down. They had no other choice. To enforce this system of total control and to crush any whisper of dissent, the coal companies employed their own private police force. These were not public lawmen. They were agents from private detective agencies, most notoriously the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. These mine guards were often hired for their aggression and their willingness to use violence. They patrolled the towns with rifles and pistols, their presence a constant reminder of the company's power. They spied on the miners, reporting anyone who spoke of organizing or complaining. They would beat men in the streets for minor infractions and evict families from their homes in the middle of the night, dumping their few belongings out in the rain. They were the iron fist that protected the company's profits, ensuring that the miners remained isolated, intimidated, and powerless. Into this sealed world of hardship and oppression, a single idea began to filter through. It was a dangerous idea, an idea that was whispered in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the mine guards. It was the idea of a union. The United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, promised a different world. A world where men were paid in real dollars, not scrip. A world with an 8-hour workday, safer conditions, and the right to speak without fear. To the coal barons, the Union was a threat to their absolute power, an infection to be stamped out at any cost. But to the thousands of men who toiled in the darkness, the Union represented something more than just better wages. It represented a chance at dignity. It represented a chance to be treated not as company property, but as free American citizens. This single, powerful idea was the seed from which a rebellion would grow. It was the spark that would soon ignite the mountains. The world of the company town was designed to create a sense of hopelessness, to make any form of resistance feel impossible. Yet, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity for hope, and in the coal fields of West Virginia, that hope was nurtured by memory. The men who gathered in secret to discuss the Union knew they were not the first to walk this path. They spoke of the struggles that came before, stories passed down from fathers and older brothers, tales that served as both an inspiration and a grim warning. They spoke of the Paint Creek Cabin Creek strike of 1912, a conflict that lasted for more than a year and showed just how brutal the coal operators were willing to be. During that strike, when thousands of miners laid down their tools, the companies responded with predictable swiftness. They brought in the Baldwin Felts agents, who evicted the striking families from their homes. The miners and their wives and children were forced to live in makeshift tent colonies, enduring the harsh mountain winter with little food or shelter. The companies then erected machine gun nests on the hills overlooking the tents and hired armored trains, nicknamed the Bull Moose Special, to patrol the railways at night, firing indiscriminately into the camps as people slept. It was a time of immense suffering, a small-scale civil war that saw the state government declare martial law 3 separate times. Though the miners fought back with courage, the strike ultimately ended in a bitter compromise, a stark lesson in the awesome power they were up against. These memories shaped the men of 1920. They understood the stakes. They knew that the call for a union was a call to war, and in this war, heroes and villains would be forged. On one side were the organizers of the United Mine Workers of America, men like Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney. They were miners themselves, charismatic and tireless speakers who traveled from camp to camp, often at great personal risk, to spread the gospel of unionism. They were the strategic minds of the movement, channeling the raw anger of the miners into an organized force. On the other side stood men like Don Chafin, the sheriff of Logan County. Chafin was more than a lawman. He was an absolute ruler. Logan County was his personal kingdom, and he ran it on behalf of the coal operators who paid him handsomely for his services. He commanded a huge force of deputies, a private army funded by the coal companies, and he used it to maintain a brutal grip on the county. No union organizer was allowed to even set foot in Logan County. Those who tried were beaten, jailed, or driven out of the state. Don Chafin was the physical embodiment of the company's tyranny, a man feared and hated in equal measure by the miners. But the flashpoint of the conflict would not be Logan County, not at first. It would be the neighboring Mingo County, which sat on the border of Kentucky. In the spring of 1920, the Union Drive in Mingo County was gaining incredible momentum. Thousands of miners had signed Union cards, filled with a renewed sense of hope and defiance. The response from the coal operators was to fire every man who joined. This was the moment of truth. To break the strike that followed, the companies called upon their most trusted and feared weapon, the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. 13. Baldwin Felts agents were dispatched to the small railroad town of Matewan in the heart of Mingo County. Their leader was Albert Felts, and his brother Lee Felts was among the agents. Their job was simple and cruel: to evict the families of the striking miners from their company-owned homes. On the morning of May 19, 1920, they began their work, walking from house to house, forcing women and children out onto the street and dumping their furniture and belongings into the muddy roads. But Matewan was different from the other company towns. Matewan had a police chief who was not on the company payroll. His name was Sid Hatfield. Hatfield was a man of the mountains, born and raised. He had worked in the mines himself and was a staunch supporter of the Union. He was known for his quiet demeanor and his skill with a pistol. He was not a man who could be bought, and he was not a man who could be intimidated. To the miners, he was one of them. He was their law. When Sid Hatfield learned what the Baldwin Felts agents were doing, he confronted them. He was joined by the town's mayor, Cabell Testerman. They told Albert Felts that the evictions were illegal without a proper court order. An argument erupted in the middle of the street, right in front of the railroad station. The agents, arrogant and accustomed to having their way, produced a warrant for Hatfield's arrest, a warrant they had secured from a friendly justice of the peace. Hatfield examined it and declared it was a fake. The air in the small town grew thick with tension. Miners who had been watching from the doorways of nearby shops began to gather, their faces grim. They were armed with their own rifles and pistols. The Baldwin Felts agents, surrounded and for the first time on hostile ground, grew nervous. Mayor Testerman tried to de-escalate the situation, saying, "Let us go to the office and see if we can settle this." But as they turned to walk, a shot rang out. To this day, no one knows for certain who fired first. Some say it was Albert Felts shooting the mayor. Others say it was a miner on a nearby rooftop. What is known is that in the seconds that followed, the street erupted into a furious storm of gunfire. It was a close-quarters, desperate battle, a shocking explosion of years of pent-up hatred. When the smoke cleared, 10 men lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. 7 of them were Baldwin Felts agents, including both Albert and Lee Felts. Mayor Cabell Testerman was also among the dead. The town of Matewan had fought back against the company's enforcers, and it had won. The news of the Matewan Massacre, as the newspapers called it, spread through the coal fields like a wildfire. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory. For the first time, the invincible Baldwin Felts agents had been defeated. The miners were electrified. They had a hero, a legend in the making, Sid Hatfield. He had stood his ground, defended his people, and survived. Songs were written about him. He became a symbol of defiance, a living testament to the idea that the power of the coal companies was not absolute. For the coal operators and the surviving members of the Baldwin Felts Agency, however, the event was a declaration of war. They would not forget the humiliation they suffered in Matewan. They would demand vengeance. And Sid Hatfield, the quiet lawman of Mingo County, now had a target on his back. The first sparks had been struck, and the fire was beginning to spread. The legend of Sid Hatfield grew with each passing day. In the hollows and coal camps of southern West Virginia, he was more than a man. He was a symbol of resistance, a hero who had looked the Baldwin Felts agents in the eye and did not back down. His story was told and retold, his bravery magnified with each telling. He soon married Jessie Testerman, the widow of the slain mayor, a union that seemed to seal his status as the guardian of Matewan. But a legend can also be a target. While the miners celebrated their champion, the coal operators and the state government were methodically planning their revenge. Sid Hatfield and 22 other men, mostly miners, were indicted for the murder of Albert Felts. The trial was a sensation, drawing reporters from across the country to the small Mingo County courthouse. The coal companies spared no expense, hiring the best lawyers to secure a conviction. They saw this as their chance to break the Union spirit by imprisoning its greatest hero. But the jury was made up of local people, people who understood the long history of oppression and violence perpetrated by the mine guards. They saw the events of May 19th not as murder, but as self-defense. After a tense trial, the verdict came back: not guilty. The town, and the Union men across the state, erupted in celebration. It seemed that for once, a small measure of justice had been found. The victory, however, was short-lived. The coal operators were relentless. They could not convict Hatfield in a friendly county, so they devised a new plan. They found a compliant judge in neighboring McDowell County, a place that was fiercely anti-Union, and secured a new indictment against Hatfield. This charge had nothing to do with the Matewan gunfight. It was a flimsy accusation of dynamiting a coal tipple, a charge many believed was completely fabricated. Hatfield was ordered to stand trial in the city of Welch, the county seat of McDowell. To the miners, this was a transparent trap. Welch was the heart of enemy territory, a place where the coal company's power was absolute and where the Baldwin-Felts agents operated with impunity. Friends and fellow Union men pleaded with Sid not to go. They feared for his life and offered to protect him. But Hatfield was a lawman, and despite his mistrust of the system, he still possessed a fundamental belief in it. He believed in facing his accusers in a court of law. He insisted he was innocent and that he would be acquitted once more. And so, on the first day of August, 1921, Sid Hatfield made a fatal decision. Accompanied by his wife, Jessie, and his good friend and fellow Union man, Ed Chambers, who faced the same charge, along with Chambers' wife, he boarded a train for Welch. Both men were unarmed. They had been assured by the governor of West Virginia himself that if they came peacefully, their safety would be guaranteed. As they arrived in Welch, the atmosphere was heavy with menace. Baldwin-Felts agents loitered around the train station and on the street corners, watching their every move. The small group walked from the station toward the McDowell County Courthouse, a formidable stone building that stood at the top of a long flight of stairs. As Sid, Jesse, Ed, and his wife began to climb the steps, a group of Baldwin-Felts agents, including C.E. Lively, a man who had spied on the Union for years, appeared at the top of the stairs. They were waiting for them. Without a word of warning, they opened fire. Sid Hatfield was shot first. He fell instantly, his body tumbling part of the way back down the steps. Ed Chambers, unarmed and seeing his friend gunned down, tried to shield their wives. The agents then turned their guns on him, shooting him in the back as he tried to run for cover. It was over in a matter of seconds. An assassination in broad daylight, on the steps of the courthouse, in front of numerous witnesses, including the victims' wives. Sid Hatfield, the hero of Matewan, was dead. The news of the murders spread with the speed of a telegraph wire and the fury of a forest fire. It traveled from town to town, from mine to mine, whispered in the darkness underground, and shouted in the Union halls above. The initial reaction was shock, then a profound and bottomless grief. But grief soon gave way to a white-hot rage. This was not a gunfight. This was a cold-blooded execution. The belief that the system could ever offer them justice was shattered. The assassination of their unarmed hero on the courthouse steps was the ultimate act of contempt. It was a message from the coal operators. There were no rules. There was no law. There was only power. And if the system would not protect them, they would protect themselves. A line had been crossed from which there could be no return. For the miners of West Virginia, this was the final provocation, the last in a long line of humiliations and brutalities. It was the breaking point. A call went out, a summons that needed no official organizer. It was a spontaneous and visceral cry for action. From every hollow, from every coal camp, men began to put down their tools, clean their rifles, and say goodbye to their families. They began to converge on a spot near the state capital called Lenz Creek, first by the dozens, then by the hundreds, and then by the thousands. They came on foot, on horseback, and in commandeered trains. They were an army of ordinary men, united by a common grief and a burning desire for justice. They wore their work clothes, their faces still smudged with coal dust. Many of them tied red bandanas around their necks, a simple piece of cloth that would become the uniform of their rebellion and a symbol of their solidarity. Within days, an astonishing 10,000 armed men had gathered, forming the largest armed civilian force ever assembled on American soil. They had a clear and simple objective: to march south. They would march to Mingo County to free their Union brothers who had been jailed under martial law. And on the way, they would march through Logan County to break the tyrannical rule of Sheriff Don Chafin once and for all. The time for petitions and trials was over. The time for marching had begun.
The encampment at Lenz Creek was a remarkable sight, a temporary city of 10,000 men that had sprung up from the green fields. It was an army unlike any America had ever seen. There were no official uniforms, no gleaming cavalry, no structured command. There were only the determined faces of men from every walk of life, brought together by a shared purpose. Young men in their teens stood alongside weathered grandfathers, black miners, Italian immigrants, and white mountaineers who had been taught to distrust one another, now shared their food and cleaned their rifles side by side. In the fight for the Union, the old divisions of race and nationality had been washed away by a powerful tide of solidarity. This was not a mob. It was a community forged in hardship. Their arsenal was a collection of personal firearms. They carried the Winchester and Marlin rifles they used for hunting squirrels and deer, the shotguns they kept behind the door for protection, and the old service pistols some had brought back from the Great War in Europe. Indeed, the veterans of that war played a crucial role, forming the men into loose companies, teaching them basic military discipline, and establishing a surprisingly effective command structure. They organized makeshift medical services, with nurses volunteering their time, and set up field kitchens to distribute the food that was being donated by sympathetic farmers and small merchants from nearby towns. And as they prepared, they adopted a symbol, a simple piece of cloth that would become their banner. Most of the men tied a red bandana around their necks. There were practical reasons for this. In the chaos of a fight, it would help them distinguish friend from foe, but it was also a symbol of their unity and their defiance. This symbol is believed by many historians to be one of the true origins of the term redneck. Long before it became a term of derision, it was a badge of honor, worn by a Union man who was willing to fight, and if necessary, to die for his rights. On the 24th of August, the march began. This redneck army, as they began to call themselves, moved south. It was a slow, deliberate procession, a river of armed men flowing through the narrow West Virginia valleys. The sight of them was astonishing. They commandeered trains, with men clinging to the roofs and sides of the rail cars, waving their rifles in the air. Others marched on foot, a column that stretched for miles, their footsteps a quiet, rhythmic thunder on the dirt roads. They sang Union songs as they marched, their voices echoing off the mountainsides, songs about solidarity and the coming of a better day. As the army advanced, panic began to grip the state government and the national leadership of the United Mine Workers. Frank Keeney and Fred Mooney, the very men who had inspired this movement, now found themselves in a difficult position. They had unleashed a force they could no longer control. They met with the governor of West Virginia, who promised reforms and an end to the mine guard system. If the miners would only turn back, believing a victory had been won without bloodshed. Keeney and Mooney rushed to intercept the marching army. They stood before the men and announced the governor's promises, urging them to go home. But the miners were skeptical. They had been betrayed by promises before. They trusted Keeney, but they no longer trusted the state. Then came a more dramatic appeal. The Union sent for the most legendary figure in the American labor movement. Mary Harris, Mother Jones. She was nearly 90 years old, a fiery, white-haired grandmother who had spent her life on the front lines of labor disputes. She was revered by the miners, who saw her as their patron saint. She stood on a tree stump before a vast crowd of the armed men and pleaded with them. She told them they were challenging the full power of the United States government and that they could not win. She held up a piece of paper, a telegram she claimed was from President Harding himself, asking them to lay down their arms. "Go home," she implored them, her voice filled with passion. "Go home, and I will see that the President takes care of your troubles." The miners listened in respectful silence, their hats held over their hearts. They loved Mother Jones, but the murder of Sid Hatfield had changed them. They quietly but firmly refused her. One miner was reported to have said, "We are not fighting the United States. We are fighting Logan County, and we are going to Mingo." Their decision was made. Not even Mother Jones could stop them now, while the miners marched. Sheriff Don Chaffin was transforming Logan County into a fortress. For him, this was not a labor dispute. It was an invasion. Using the vast funds provided to him by the coal operators, he assembled a private army of his own, numbering around 3,000 men. It was a mix of his own loyal deputies, mine guards from every company in the region, and hundreds of untrained civilian volunteers from the towns, who were told that their homes were about to be attacked by a horde of murderous Bolsheviks. Chaffin's army was smaller, but it was far better equipped. They had machine guns and an abundance of ammunition purchased from the federal government. More importantly, they had the terrain. Chaffin chose to make his stand on Blair Mountain, a massive, 10-mile-long ridge that formed a natural wall between the miners and Logan County. He sent his men up the mountainside to establish a formidable defensive line. They dug trenches, built breastworks from rock and timber, and positioned their machine gun nests at strategic points, overlooking the only paths the miners could take. Chaffin also added a modern and terrifying element to his defense. He hired several private airplanes. These biplanes, which took off from a field in Logan, were used for reconnaissance, flying over the advancing miners to track their numbers and movements. But they were also armed. The pilots carried homemade bombs, pipe bombs filled with nuts and bolts and scrap metal, which they intended to drop on the men below. The stage was now set for a battle of a kind America had never seen. On one side, a massive people's army, armed with hunting rifles and a burning sense of injustice. On the other, a smaller, better armed defensive force, dug in on a fortified mountain, with the power of industry and air power on their side. The Redneck army had reached the foot of the mountains. Don Chaffin's men were on the ridges above, watching and waiting. The last day of August in 1921 dawned with an unnatural stillness on Blair Mountain. On the slopes below, 10,000 miners lay waiting, concealed among the trees and rocks. They were a vast but scattered force, looking up at the imposing ridge that stood between them and their goal. On the crest of that ridge, Don Chaffin's defenders peered down from their newly dug trenches and fortified machine gun nests, their own anxieties masked by a show of readiness. For a few quiet hours, the mountain held its breath. Then, a single shot echoed through a valley, followed by another, and then a rolling thunder of rifle fire erupted along the 10-mile front. The Battle of Blair Mountain had begun. This was not a battle in the traditional sense. There were no grand cavalry charges or neatly ordered lines of infantry. It was a brutal, sprawling, and chaotic mountain war. A series of desperate skirmishes fought up steep, tree-covered hillsides. The miners, relying on their knowledge of the terrain and their skills as hunters, advanced in small groups, using every rock and tree for cover. They would crawl forward under fire, trying to gain ground, their objective being to dislodge the defenders from their superior positions on the high ground. From the ridgetops, Chaffin's men laid down a withering fire. The steady, hammering sound of their machine guns became the dominant noise of the battle, a mechanical heartbeat of death that echoed relentlessly through the mountains. Bullets tore through the leaves, thudding into tree trunks and chipping away at the stone barricades the miners tried to erect. The fighting was intensely personal and incredibly ferocious. Men who had been neighbors a few years before were now trying to kill each other across a few hundred yards of unforgiving wilderness. For 5 days, the battle raged. The days were a blur of smoke, noise, and fear. The nights brought a tense quiet, punctuated by sporadic gunfire, as both sides tried to rest and regroup. The miners fought with a courage born of desperation. In several places along the line, they launched furious assaults, managing to push Chaffin's defenders back and gain a foothold on the ridge. But each victory was temporary and paid for in blood. Chaffin's men, better supplied and holding the defensive advantage, would regroup and launch furious counterattacks. The line bent, but it did not break. A bloody stalemate began to set in. The miners had heart, but Chaffin had technology. His hired airplanes made daily flights over the battlefield. The sight of these strange, noisy machines in the sky was unsettling for the miners, most of whom had never seen an airplane up close before. The planes served as Chaffin's eyes, allowing him to see the miners' positions and direct his forces. But they were also used as weapons. Pilots and observers would lean out of their open cockpits and drop their homemade bombs over the side. These crude explosives were not particularly accurate or deadly, but their psychological effect was enormous. The sound of an engine overhead would send men scrambling for cover, their nerves frayed by this new and unpredictable threat from the sky. It was a terrifying glimpse into the future of warfare, deployed by a private army against American citizens. As the battle wore on, the situation grew more desperate. Ammunition was running low on both sides. Food was scarce. The number of dead and wounded was climbing, though an exact count was impossible in the chaos. The state government of West Virginia seemed powerless to stop the fighting. It became clear that this was no longer a local dispute. It was a full-scale insurrection, and the news was shocking the entire nation. In Washington, D.C., President Warren G. Harding could no longer ignore the private war raging in the Appalachians. On September 2nd, he issued a presidential proclamation, declaring the situation to be one of rebellion and ordering the insurgents to disperse immediately. He placed the entire region under federal martial law and, to enforce his order, he dispatched federal troops. The first sign of their arrival was the appearance of a squadron of Martin MB-1 bombers in the sky. These were not Chaffin's small private planes. These were the heavy bombers of the United States Army Air Service, sent under the command of the famous aviation pioneer, General Billy Mitchell. They did not drop any bombs, but their presence was an unmistakable message. The federal government had arrived, and its power was absolute. Soon after, 2,000 federal soldiers, many of them veterans of the First World War, began to arrive by train. They were professional, disciplined, and utterly neutral. These doughboys, in their olive-drab uniforms, formed a line between the two warring factions. For the miners, this was the moment of truth. Their fight had never been with the United States. They saw themselves as patriotic citizens fighting for their constitutional rights against the tyranny of the coal companies. They were willing to fight Don Chafin's private army to the death, but they would not raise their guns against the soldiers of their own country. To do so would be to commit treason, the very crime they were being accused of. The decision was a painful one. They had fought so hard and had come so close. But they knew they could not win a war against the United States Army with heavy hearts. The leaders of the miners' army passed the word down the line. It was over. Slowly, reluctantly, the firing sputtered out. Men who had spent days fighting their way up the mountain now quietly began to emerge from the woods. Their red bandanas still tied around their necks. They laid down their rifles at the feet of the federal soldiers. There was no formal surrender ceremony, only a weary, somber acceptance of reality. The largest armed rebellion in America since the Civil War had come to a quiet and inconclusive end, not with a final, bloody battle, but with a difficult choice born of patriotism. The miners turned their backs on the mountain and began the long walk home. The silence that fell over Blair Mountain was not one of peace, but of defeat, as the miners surrendered their weapons to the federal troops. They were met not with hostility, but with a kind of weary professionalism. The soldiers, many of whom came from working-class backgrounds themselves, seemed to understand that these were not traitors, but desperate men. They were given safe passage back to their homes, and for a brief moment, it seemed the conflict might end without further reprisal. But this was a fragile illusion. As soon as the federal troops withdrew, Don Chafin's authority, backed by the full power of the state, returned with a vengeance. A wave of arrests swept through the coal camps. Hundreds of miners were rounded up and jailed. The state, eager to crush the Union once and for all, pursued the most serious charges imaginable. Grand juries indicted nearly 1,000 men. Most were charged with conspiracy to commit murder and insurrection. The leaders of the march, including Frank Keeney and the Union organizer Bill Blizzard, were charged with treason against the state of West Virginia. It was a charge that carried the possibility of the death penalty, a legal weapon intended to send a chilling message to anyone who would dare to challenge the coal operators again. The trials began. A long and expensive legal war that replaced the armed one. The Union, its treasury already depleted, poured all of its remaining resources into defending the men. They hired the best lawyers they could find, and the nation watched as these mountain miners were put on trial for their lives. The first treason trial, that of Bill Blizzard, took place not in the hostile environment of Logan County, but in the more neutral setting of Charlestown, far to the east. The prosecution painted the miners as a violent mob of Bolsheviks, intent on overthrowing the government. But the defense skillfully told the jury the miners' side of the story. They spoke of the company towns, the scrip, the mine guards, and the cold-blooded murder of Sid Hatfield on the courthouse steps. After a dramatic trial, the jury, made up of farmers who understood the struggle against powerful interests, returned a verdict of not guilty. The acquittal was a stunning victory, but the state was not finished. they continued to prosecute other miners on lesser charges. The trials dragged on for years, draining the lifeblood from the Union movement in southern West Virginia. While some men were acquitted, many others were convicted and sentenced to prison. The financial and emotional cost was immense. Men who had marched together now faced their fate alone in courtrooms, their families struggling to survive without them. In the immediate aftermath, the Battle of Blair Mountain appeared to be a catastrophic failure for the Union. The UMWA's presence in southern West Virginia was effectively broken for the next decade. The company towns, the script system, and the brutal mine guards remained in place. The miners returned to the same oppressive conditions they had fought to escape. The sacrifice of the men on the mountain seemed to have been in vain. The story itself was actively suppressed. For decades, it was scrubbed from local history books. State officials and coal companies had no interest in remembering a time when thousands of citizens took up arms against them. The battle became a secret, a piece of forbidden history whispered among families but never spoken of in public. The battlefield itself was left to the forest, the trenches slowly filling with leaves, the bullet scars on the trees gradually healing over. But history has a long memory. While the miners lost the battle, their struggle was not forgotten by the rest of the nation. The sheer scale of the uprising, a private war that required the intervention of the president, shocked the American public. It drew national attention to the brutal, feudal conditions that existed in the coal fields. The stories told in the courtrooms and newspapers planted a seed in the national consciousness. That seed would bear fruit a decade later, during the Great Depression. With President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the White House, the political climate of the country shifted dramatically. The nation was ready for a new deal, a new relationship between labor and capital. The same federal government that had sent troops to crush the miners' rebellion now passed landmark legislation, like the National Industrial Recovery Act and the Wagner Act, which, for the first time, guaranteed the rights of workers to organize unions and bargain collectively without fear of being fired or beaten. When the union organizers returned to southern West Virginia in the 1930s, they found a generation ready to receive them. The sacrifices of the men who fought on Blair Mountain had not been forgotten. They had become the stuff of legend, a heroic foundation upon which a new, and this time successful, union movement was built. The struggle that had cost so much in 1921 finally achieved its goals, and the oppressive system of the company towns began to crumble at last. Today, the mountain still stands, a quiet monument to the men who fought there. Their story is a powerful reminder that history is not only made by those whose names we read in textbooks. It is also shaped by ordinary people, driven by the desire for fairness and human dignity. The miners of Blair Mountain lost their battle, but in the long arc of history, their defiant stand for justice echoed far beyond their quiet hollows, and helped to build a more equitable America for the generations that followed. Their war, once forgotten, now reminds us of a time when the mountains of West Virginia roared with the righteous anger of free men.